The Buddha's concept of non-self probably arose in part because of the philosophical milieu known as the milieu of ancient India. This concept of the self was generally found in the major schools of philosophy, like the Upanishads, the Vedas, and in Jainism, which were established before the Buddha himself. These schools taught that ultimate reality is the only true self that exists, and that this self is actually a state of non-being or non-existence, since this state of being is beyond karma, beyond samsara, the cycle of birth and death, and beyond time. This level of self is the oneness in all things. It's the substrate of the entire universe. It is Brahma, God, the infinite. It is eternal, it is unchanging, and filled with everlasting joy. So when a monk or yogi or any other religious or spiritual renunciate is working on reducing and eliminating their samskaras, or mental defects, it's important to keep in mind the truth of Anatta. Anatta is the Buddhist equivalent of the Hindu Anātman, which means without self, often translated as non-self. This concept is important because the understanding or comprehension of it is what frees us from defects that give us a very strong sense of self, like pride. There are many defects that we can get rid of simply by means of self-discipline and restraint. So one can purify a lot of cravings and addictions just by starving them over time. So many of these afflictions and addictions don't actually require very sophisticated, complicated comprehensions. They can just be eliminated through restraint. They get weakened over time when they're not fed. But when we find ourselves struggling to do this, sometimes it's because we don't have the whys on how to do it. We don't understand the aversion or affliction. And with anger and lust, on the contrary, these emotions require very deep emotional wisdom or comprehension in order to be renounced and finally broken down after that comprehension, typically in meditation or sleep. So when it comes to working on pride, I would say that there are a couple stages that we tend to go through before reaching selflessness. The first stage is being a student who's new to the teaching and has that conventional sense of self that most other people in the world have. This is someone with a reasonable amount of pride and a very strong sense of identity that they created over a long period of time because of influences like their name, their appearance, their taste, and the people around them. And this person may have invested a lot of time and energy into their individuality by collecting identifiers like nicknames, aliases, a style, interests, and even different genders. The next stage that the student goes through is the actual practice of self-renunciation. So the student has just been taught spiritual ethics and decides to embody them. In this case, to renounce pride. And after a few weeks or months, they may have been very diligent in restraining their pride and reducing unnecessary self-expression. Things like talking too much about themselves or arguing and self-justifying. But then what can happen to some people is that the practice becomes either frustrating or fanatical. So on one hand, the student might start to get fed up with being so passive and generous around difficult and rude or undeserving people. They're getting more and more frustrated every time they have to restrain their anger when faced with impertinence or unfairness. And it's possible, and I would also say common, because I was experiencing this too, to start developing a more and more negative taste toward yourself as this new kind of person, this spiritual person that we've become. And that right there is the problem, where we have to catch ourselves immediately. Because what just happened early on in this practice, in a subtle way, is that we created a whole new sense of self, a whole new identity. You became that Buddhist practitioner, or you became that spiritual YouTuber, that yogi, and every now and then you imagine yourself, whether you knew it or not. And we tend to imagine ourselves in situations impulsively and typically without awareness all the time, regularly. Whether it was deliberate or not, we are imagining ourselves doing our things, and now we're wearing our robes or practicing these principles and being this new, gentle, virtuous, passive spiritual person. And after some time, we just get fed up with it. Sometimes it's a lot to chew for us, right? When we try to be so devout in these practices. So situations with other people were getting on our nerves more and more. And then we start viewing ourselves more and more negatively, because that sense of self is still there. Even though we're trying to be selfless, all of a sudden we've created this character, this identity, this selfless identity. And now we start seeing ourselves like this, like some kind of this weak, passive, or effeminate spiritual fool, because people don't even believe what we're talking about sometimes, and that we're tired of being now. On the other hand, the opposite phenomenon also happens to people very often. They begin to practice for the first time. They make improvements to their behavior. They reduce their conceit. They reduce their pride. But then they create a similar spiritual identity of themselves in their mind, with the difference being that they admire it a lot. And in both circumstances, the virtue of humility and selflessness is just not fully understood. Both kinds of students are still carrying a sense of self, and that's the problem. Because they're frequently thinking about themselves, whether they want to or not, imagining themselves in different situations and feeling either good or bad about it, having a preference toward it. Because we've been carrying this sense of self for our whole lives, so it's not just going to disappear. Even when we act selfless, visualizing ourselves on a regular basis is still going to keep happening. And we're going to have preferences toward that. So the complete renunciation of selfhood from pride and anger requires that our sense of self ceases to exist entirely. As I explained earlier, Anatta, the doctrine of non-self, is a fundamental principle that teaches us that beyond conventional reality and perceptions, there is no intrinsic, distinct, individual form or self. There is only oneness. There is only that unity of all things. That is true individuality. That is what it truly means to be. When this is understood, not only do we cease expressions of pride and anger, but we cease all preferences toward ourselves, and we stop imagining ourselves in various scenarios, because we really don't have to. We realize the irrelevance of having a self-image and the irrelevance of the opinions of others, because the self does not exist, ultimately. our personality, our character that we've made for ourselves, the way we look, it ultimately doesn't exist. So at this point, there isn't any need to feel frustrated every time you're having to restrain your anger around somebody who's critical or rude to you, because you have the awareness that you don't exist, and neither do they. So in addition to the ultimate reality, impermanence is another truth to be aware of. I mean, this is part of it. When all things come to pass and we reach the end of our lives, we will cease to exist. Even terrestrially. And nothing that bothered us in the past will matter anymore. That's why it's irrelevant. Because ultimately we don't exist. If we pass in time, we disappear physically, terrestrially, then we don't have intrinsic existence. That critical person is going to die someday, and so are we. We're not permanent, so we don't have ultimate existence. This is why the Venerable Master Samael Un Waor would sometimes say in public speeches, he would explain that how can one accept an insult if there's no I of pride to receive it? So what others think of us and the way we think of ourselves is irrelevant, ultimately, when we don't have the psychological aggregates to react to these negative impressions. And of course, most of us are still working toward eliminating our defects, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't live by the doctrine of non-self before truly becoming selfless, because this concept is something that we can practice right now. So this has been the reminder of Anatta. Whenever you feel triggered by other people in situations, always remember non-self. Remember that you don't exist ultimately, and neither do they. We don't have intrinsic existence. We're not the people we think we are, with the certain facial characteristics and the way we dress and the way we sound and our name, our race, and all that. We are not these people. Our individual senses of selves are not the real thing. In fact, who we are is the being. We are the being. That's our true self. Remember that pride and anger provoking situations are ultimately empty and meaningless because they're impermanent, and we are impermanent. Keep denying yourself every time your pride is provoked, and you will eventually conquer it. Sabbe sata sukhi hontu.